Welcome back, everybody. So South Africans were encouraged last year when President Cyril Ramaphosa made crucial appointments to strengthen the country's law enforcement institutions. Shamila Batohi took office in February 2019 as the new National Director of Public Prosecutions. Hermione Cronje was appointed as head of the NPA Unit, tasked with investigating and prosecuting state capture cases. And then Willie Hofmeyr came back to the Prosecuting Authority 3 years after being removed as the head of the Asset Forfeiture Unit. But South Africans are yet to see any prosecutions relating to state capture. Willie Hofmeyr, of course, retired at the end of, I think it was October last year, officially. He was now known as the former head of the Special Investigating Unit and former head of the Asset Forfeiture Unit. In studio is our guest here. Great to have you with us. Thanks so much for coming in.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me.
Are you enjoying your retirement?
I am, actually. It's a bit strange not to be working a 14-hour day, but I'm getting used to it.
Only 14 hours with everything that you have gone through. You were saying from 1998?
Yeah, that's when I started at the National Prosecuting Authority, and I set up the Asset Forfeiture Unit at that time.
I mean, it's a rich history that you certainly have. I mean, you've served under numerous presidents, well, basically all of them, besides former President Nelson Mandela, but you still worked on the Constitution.
Briefly under Mr. Mandela as well.
And you also sat drawing up the Constitution as well.
Indeed, I think that really was one of the most exciting times of my life, was, in a sense, writing the new ground rules for a democracy. And, I think the Constitution perhaps is not quite as strong as it should be, but certainly at the time it was groundbreaking, and I think internationally it's sort of held in very high regard for how far it went in protecting rights.
Yeah, indeed. And you know, we've seen the country from those days up until now, and you've been a key witness to all of this. How do you feel about it?
I think the first 6-7 years of our democracy was probably the most exciting and interesting years of my life. But you know, we fairly soon started having problems with the removal of Vusi Pikoli at the Prosecuting Authority, for instance. Then we had some pretty bad appointments at various times. So it's been fantastic to have a new and credible head of the Prosecuting Authority now, and I'm full of hope for the future.
Yeah. You know, it is. I mean, you say it was the most exciting times back then, and many would say it is the most depressing times right now, after all of these years where we've almost just seen the degradation of South Africa, the degradation of these institutions that you've been a part of, and this has been something that has led to the state capture that we're seeing, that led to the destruction of so many of the institutions that should be thriving and yet are all falling apart. Your role in all of this, how do you feel about that?
I mean, let me say, I think sort of the years from 2014 to 2018 was probably some of the worst years in my life. Yeah. I've spent quite a lot of time in prison, so that's saying something. But yeah, you know, I think state capture did mean the capture of law enforcement as well, because clearly those people who were stealing from the government wanted to make sure that there would be nobody to hold them to account. So I think that's part of the reason why law enforcement went through a very rough time. Yeah. But, you know, I think the new heads at the Hawks, General Labia and Shamila Batohi at the NPA, does give me a lot of confidence for the future.
Yeah. Did you know that this was all happening while you were in these positions?
Yeah, I mean, I think I started, because we were doing so many corruption cases in the early days, I did get a sense of just how pervasive the problem had become. And certainly, I think my initial removal from as SIU head when Jacob Zuma became president was the first serious warning shot, and then my removal from asset forfeiture when Sean Abrams became head of the NPA was, you know, was certainly for me serious signals that law enforcement was being captured. And it wasn't just me, it was a range of Anwar Dramat, Robert McBride, all those sort of people were being removed from their jobs.
I mean, a very important question to ask is, Why didn't you do things differently? If you saw this was happening and you know that this was having serious repercussions on the country and on everything that the country stands for, why could you not have done more?
I think I find myself in a very difficult position, partly because I was in a fairly key place in the NPA, and I knew that if I resigned in protest, probably a very bad person who would be appointed, who would be there for the next 20, 30 years in the top management of the NPA. So, I talked a lot to some of my old comrades, particularly amongst the veterans grouping, and I think most people said I must just sit there and stick it out. But it was incredibly depressing and demoralizing to sit at work and essentially have no meaningful work to do.
Yeah.
So it was, I think, sometimes much harder than the years I spent in prison, actually.
Yeah. That in itself can be a very hard pill for South Africans to swallow, to know that somebody who sits in a position as yourself, a former head of a special investigating unit, a former head of an asset forfeiture unit, key role players, and yet admitting that you were sitting there with nothing to do and the state was being stolen. You could have left, you could have done things differently. In hindsight, now you're speaking out. Let's go back. What could you have done differently? What should you have done differently?
I did actually speak out at the time. You may not remember, but there was a big litigation case involving the removal of Mxolisi Nxasana's NDPP. And I filed an affidavit in that case in his support, where I spelt out a lot of the detail of what was going wrong in the NPA at the time. And Mr. Abrams was very determined to try and fire me for doing that, but I resisted, and I wanted to stay just so that the bad person isn't appointed in the position for the next 20, 30 years. So it was sort of hard choices that one had to make at the time. It certainly was the least pleasant part of my life, but I thought it was important to not just hand everything over to the bad people.
Yeah. So you're now obviously out of these law enforcement institutions, and like the SIU, the NPA, and last week in Cape Town you joined forces with civil society, basically calling for people to be jailed. Now, tell me about this, and then we'll chat a bit further.
No, I'm sort of very interested and have been an admirer of the work that various civil society organizations have done over the last 5 to 8 years. I think they've really played a critical role in resisting some of the litigating against the state on some of the state capture issues, but also making sure that society is alerted to what's going on. So I was basically asked to speak about, in a sense, about how law enforcement was captured, and I think the point that I try to make is the Constitution, and the chapters in the Constitution around law enforcement basically gives the President fairly unqualified powers to make appointments. And I feel co-responsible because I actually helped to draft some of those parts of the Constitution. But the point I'm making is that I think while we have a good President, we really should look at strengthening the ways in which appointments are made, so that it becomes less easy in future to capture law enforcement. And of course, the other part of the state that was very much captured was the procurement process, which was where the big contracts are given. And, again, it's really 4 or 5 or 6 people that you need to put in place there to ensure that the contracts go to the wrong people. And if those 6 people are pretty sophisticated, it's not easy to prove that they fiddled the system.
Yeah.
So I think we have an opportunity now to fix some of those things, and I think it's very important that we start thinking about how they should be fixed.
Yeah. People are very angry when, at you and at people that saw all of this happening, and obviously it's difficult because you do come from such a wealth of history and you have done so much. But I mean, if we just have to go back to the spy tape saga, many would say, if that had gone ahead then, would we really be in this position that we're in right now? Couldn't it all been stopped?
I fear not. I think at the time, the sort of capture of the NPA, of the ANC itself, was only manifested by the election of Zuma as the president at the time. I think the bad people got firmly in control of the ruling party at that time, and I think that was reflected subsequently in the appointments that were being made.
Yeah.
So I don't think it depended on one person. I think, we've seen massive revelations about the scale of corruption in most of the country over the past few years, now that we're allowed to investigate it. So, I regret what I did at the time. I think I let my anger that I still felt about Mbeki's removal of Vusi Pikoli from the NPA shortly before then, that I think was one of the most devastating moves in my career at the NPA. And, I think that was really the beginning of the capture of the NPA. And it wasn't under Zuma, it started under Mbeki.
And that's something that we need to realize. And a big question we need to ask you now, is the NPA still captured now under the Ramaphosa environment?
I think the NPA is not captured, because I think we have a good and honest national director and head of the NPA. But certainly there are a range of appointments that were made in the NPA in very senior positions that were questionable. And so I think we still sit, or Shamila Batohi still sits with a challenge about who in the organization she can trust and who she cannot trust to deal with difficult corruption cases. So I don't think the battle is kind of over and won, but I think we've made significant progress as a country over the last 18 months or so.
Why are we stuck, though? And I have to ask you this: why has there not been a single prosecution? If we're being told that we've got good heads in place, we've got so much evidence. There is evidence coming out every single day, whether it be through inquiries, commissions, ad hoc committees. And we can go all the way back to the days of Nkandla. We can go back to, as you mentioned, into the Suriti Commission. We can go and have a look at Busasa, the things that Agritzi has been saying, and yet not a single person has been prosecuted or finds themselves in, as you put it, with the civil society in a yellow uniform or an orange overall, I beg your pardon. Why? Why are we stuck?
I think it is important to understand that many of these corruption cases are very complex cases to investigate. And if you look overseas, the British Serious Fraud Office, for example, that does some of the big complex commercial crime cases, their cases often take 2-3 years before they get to court, because there is so much documents, and you can't go to court without the prosecutors having looked at all the documents, understand whether there's evidence there that may exculpate your accused person. And with the proliferation of data on computers, obviously that has become a lot more complicated, because everybody has a computer, everybody has a cell phone. You seize those things, then you have to start knowing what is actually everything on those, on the cell phone or on the computer. So I think it's important that the investigations and the prosecutions are prepared properly. We do not want to fail when we go to court. And so I think it's important that we must give the NPA and the Hawks time to do their jobs properly, so that we don't have fiascos in court afterwards. But I think the other issue that complicates us is that most of the corruption happens in a pretty organized way. It's not one person stealing the money. It's a person working with others. Orders are probably coming from higher up. And you want to make sure that when you investigate the case, you get to the higher up people, the people who organized the corruption, who made the appointments of the corrupt people. And so in that sense, it's vital that we do the job as well as we can, and that is going to take time. And I think we must give Shamila Batohi and her team time to tackle these issues properly, and to make sure that we get to the people who were behind, who were organizing what was happening. I
mean, you talk about this and accountability and prosecutions of the head of these institutions. Shouldn't they be the first to fall? I mean, as you say, and clearly you have the internal knowledge of exactly what goes on, who appoints, and why they are put into these positions. But, I mean, you look at a man like Sean Abrahams. His appointment was later declared constitutionally invalid in a court of law, and yet he's walking away.
Indeed, although I hope he's not going to walk away for a long time. But, you know, I think many of those issues, and I don't want to be specific about investigations, but are being investigated. And I think, for me, actually, the Zondo Commission is a very important part of what we have. I think they obviously don't have a power to do prosecutions, but I think they've built up a very good capability for investigations. And I think they are giving us a much better understanding and picture of what happened, how it happened, who was involved. And I think a lot of that evidence is going to law enforcement, and I think we will see action taking place.
Yeah.
But I don't think we should push to rush into cases until they are properly prepared. However impatient we do get.
And this is the reality. I mean, the rush and the urgency. We were promised so much. I mean, we had analysis from Gogo Obiri Machite. I don't know if you saw that interview a little bit earlier. And it was never about talking of state capture. It's talking about party capture. And that we talk about those 8, 9 wasted years. And it was never about a president. It's about a ruling party. This is a concern, and it's a major concern. When you look at the ANC, can it recover? It is so divided right now. Can we trust them to rule us and to lead us in the right direction?
I mean, I think what you say is correct. That is, that individuals don't capture the state. Political parties capture the state. And that's the nature of democracy, in a sense. When there's an election and a new party gets elected, it takes over all the levers of power in the state. And it's a legitimate part of democracy. But it is also part of democracy that can very easily be abused to systematically appoint bad people. And I think to a large degree that is what has happened. I think quite a bit of that is being reversed. But also when civil servants get appointed, they get appointed till retirement. There's not a term for their appointment. So it's not so easy to get rid of the bad appointments that have been made in the last few years. One of the things that I'm advocating quite strongly for is a much more rigorous integrity assessment process. When I was head of the SIU, we really had a set of about 30 integrity-related questions. People had to answer it in front of a sort of lie detector machine called a voice stress analysis. And I think that's one of the reasons why the SIU stayed quite honest and clean. But I think that technology really should be used for all the senior people in law enforcement, as well as the people in the procurement systems, because that's the other place where capture of the state is very real and where things are manipulated to favor certain people.
I want to, before we wrap up the interview, is to talk on developments that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. I mean, we go back to the beginning of the interview where we spoke about you were one of the key role players in drafting the Constitution and, you know, having a look at that bridge to reconciliation of the past and where we are. Couple of points to bring up here. You see comments coming up from our former Deputy President, we can call him, during the reconciliation times, F.W. de Klerk, who received our Nobel Peace Prize with Nelson Mandela, who comes out and not once, twice, but 3 times goes and says that apartheid was not a crime against humanity. Anybody knows that that was a crime against humanity, and I don't think that's even up for discussion. Do you think that perhaps we ask for accountability now from leaders, but there was never accountability from former leaders? And is that possibly where we're at right now? Is that this legacy of accountability has never existed in South Africa, and why should it exist now?
I mean, I think it is true that there's been a lack of accountability, but I think that's been one of the problems of state capture, is that people who were doing openly bad things were not held to account. So certainly in a democracy, that's something that we really have to turn around. I don't really want to comment on what politicians are saying. I do think de Klerk deserves some praise for his decision to negotiate a democracy. I don't think at the time that we in the democratic movement felt, and I was the leading agitator at the time, I don't think we were anywhere close to winning power in South Africa. I think without the negotiations, without a peaceful transition, I think the country would have gone through a very long and terrible battle, probably for decades, and we certainly wouldn't be where we are now. So, I disagree with some of the things that he's saying, but I do think that we should not let it color the nature of the democracy that we won through peaceful negotiations, which was very tough and rough at the time, and lots of Boipatong massacre, all sorts of terrible things happened at the time. But at the end we did win our democracy, mainly through bloodshed and tears, but also because, in a sense, I think those in the ruling party at the time were wise enough in the end to realize that they cannot continue to rule like this, and that some sort of negotiations were important.
Willie Hofmeyr, I have to leave it there, but thank you for coming in and talking to us here on the program this morning. Willie Hofmeyr, attorney by profession, just retired in December from the NPA after spending most of his adult life working in the country's law enforcement institutions, including at the SIU and NPA, and last week in Cape Town joining forces with civil society, saying the wheels of justice are just too slow. State capture perpetrators should be in orange overalls. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, it is now way past 8, 3 minutes past 8 actually. Apologies on that one, Sakina. Let's get